The sweet fragrance of frangipani blossoms mingled with the metallic scent of freshly spilled blood as dawn broke over the Beaumont Estate on Christmas morning, 1924. Steam rose from warm bodies scattered across the estate's pristine veranda, where holiday garlands now dripped crimson onto hand-carved Belgian furniture. The silence that followed the screaming would haunt the Kasai Province for generations, broken only by the distant sound of church bells calling faithful Christians to celebrate the birth of their Savior. This is the story of how one man's devotion to justice transformed Christmas into Judgment Day, and how the season of peace became a declaration of war against those who had turned human beings into property. Before we descend into the darkness that consumed the Sankuru River Valley that holy morning, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The humid air of the Belgian Congo carried scents that European noses never quite adjusted to: the earthy richness of red clay after tropical rain, the pungent sweetness of fermenting palm oil, and the acrid smoke from cooking fires that burned constantly in the workers' quarters. These were the olfactory landmarks of a colonial world built on extraction and exploitation, where the luxury of Christmas morning coffee and porcelain cups depended on the suffering of hands that would never hold such delicate things. In the Thornwood Hills overlooking the Sankuru River Valley, the morning mist clung to ancient mahogany trees like the spirits of ancestors watching over their descendants. This was landscape that remembered freedom, where traditional hunting paths wound through forests that had sheltered communities for centuries before white men arrived with their strange obsession for documenting ownership of things that could never truly be possessed. The Beaumont palm oil estate sprawled across 12,000 acres of what had once been communal hunting grounds, its neat rows of oil palms stretching toward horizons that seemed to promise escape but delivered only more servitude. The main house stood elevated on a small hill, its white columns and red tile roof a deliberate echo of European grandeur transplanted into African soil. But grandeur built on stolen labor carries its own fragility, and Christmas morning 1924 would reveal just how thin the veneer of civilization could become. Mathieu Kabongo stood 6 feet 2 inches tall with shoulders broadened by 15 years of forced labor in the palm groves, but his eyes held something that years of brutality had failed to extinguish. Born in the village of Kananga in 1885, he had lived through the transition from traditional governance to colonial administration, watching his community's autonomy dissolve under Belgian bureaucracy that valued rubber quotas over human dignity. His wife Celeste possessed a rare gift in colonial Congo: literacy. As a house servant in the mission station of Saint-Pierre, she had learned to read from Sister Anne-Marie, who believed that educated natives might become better Christians. What the good sister never anticipated was how literacy could become a weapon in the hands of someone who understood exactly what the colonial documents actually said about the people they claimed to protect. The Kabongo family had endured what many endured in King Albert's Congo: the systematic destruction of traditional life in service of European prosperity. André, their eldest son, bore scars from the Shikot whip for failing to meet rubber collection quotas. Pierre carried the psychological wounds of watching his childhood friends disappear into the forced labor gangs that built railways through the interior. Marie had grown into womanhood under the constant threat of sexual violence that colonial administrators dismissed as inevitable consequences of racial proximity. From the journal of Father Gabriel Rousseau, dated December 15, 1924, met with the Kabongo family today after Sunday service. Mathieu speaks little during our conversations, but his silence carries weight that troubles me. There is something in his manner that suggests deep currents moving beneath still waters. His wife reads scripture with unusual intensity, though I suspect her interpretations differ significantly from church doctrine. The Kabongo family had attempted to find sanctuary within the colonial system 4 times between 1920 and 1924. Each effort followed the same devastating pattern that characterized Congolese resistance to forced labor: initial accommodation followed by increasing demands, compliance followed by escalating punishments, and finally expulsion, or worse when their humanity became inconvenient to colonial efficiency. Their first attempt involved relocating to work the palm oil processing at the Beaumont Estate, where Monsieur Charles Beaumont promised fair wages and decent housing in exchange for skilled labor. Mathieu's experience with traditional palm oil extraction made him valuable, while Celeste's literacy qualified her for record-keeping duties. The arrangement lasted 8 months before accusations of theft resulted in public whipping and demotion to field labor. The second relocation took them to the mission station of Saint-Pierre, where Father Rousseau offered protection in exchange for assistance with his evangelical work among local communities. Mathieu's knowledge of traditional customs and Celeste's translation skills proved invaluable for missionary operations. But when their success at converting villagers began threatening established trading relationships between colonial administrators and traditional chiefs, the family found themselves accused of sedition and ordered to leave mission grounds. The third attempt brought them to Luluabourg, where colonial administrators needed skilled workers for the expanding telegraph system. André's mechanical aptitude and Pierre's physical strength qualified them for technical training, while Marie's domestic skills secured her employment in administrative households. The family lived in relative stability for nearly a year before a European telegraph operator's accusation of sabotage resulted in André's imprisonment and the family's exile from the administrative center. By the winter of 1924 they had settled in the abandoned copal works near Devil's Bend on the Sankuru River, where previous colonial enterprises had extracted tree resin before moving to more profitable ventures. The isolation offered safety from administrative attention, but it also provided perfect conditions for planning something that colonial authorities would never anticipate from people they considered incapable of sophisticated thought. The irony was not lost on anyone capable of historical perspective. The same region that had swallowed countless traditional communities during the Rubber Terror now sheltered another group of displaced people. But the Kabongos were not simply hiding. Celeste had spent her months at the mission station learning more than scripture and domestic skills. She had absorbed lessons about record-keeping, communication networks and the administrative vulnerabilities that kept colonial systems functioning. Mathieu had been a traditional hunter before colonization, skilled in tracking, patience and understanding the behavioral patterns of his prey. André and Pierre had received technical training that taught them about infrastructure, timing, and the weak points in systems that appeared invulnerable. Marie had learned household management skills that included detailed knowledge of European social customs, daily routines and the blind spots that privilege created in the minds of those who possessed it. Hunger had always been a constant in colonial Congo, but the hunger that developed in the Kabongo family during their isolation went beyond physical need. It was hunger for acknowledgement of their humanity, hunger for justice that colonial courts would never provide, hunger for revenge against a system that treated them as renewable resources rather than people capable of love, grief and fury. The first travelers began disappearing from the river routes near Devil's Bend in late November 1924, a Belgian merchant transporting manufactured goods to interior trading posts, a missionary couple carrying medical supplies to remote settlements, a colonial administrator inspecting palm oil operations in preparation for Christmas production bonuses. The disappearances followed no pattern that colonial authorities could recognize, partly because those authorities understood geography better than they understood the people whose labor made their maps meaningful. Every vanishing occurred somewhere along the network of river crossings and forest paths that connected the Sankuru Valley's scattered settlements, but colonial investigators attributed missing persons to the usual dangers that white people faced in tropical Africa: disease, accidents, wild animals or hostile natives acting without organization or planning. District Commissioner Laurent Dubois noted something unusual in his reports from that period, though he lacked the cultural knowledge to interpret what he was observing. Every disappearance coincided with reports of unusual smoke patterns rising from the forested areas near the abandoned copal works.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Smoke that rose too consistently and burned too long to be coming from simple cooking fires or traditional hunting activities. What the colonial administrators could not understand was that the Kabongo family had moved beyond mere survival during their months of isolation. They had discovered something that years of systematic dehumanization had taught them about power, justice and the terrible intimacy that exists between predator and prey. The forest that sheltered them was about to become their hunting ground, and the colonial society that had rejected their humanity was about to learn what monsters it had created through its own systematic cruelty. The smoke that Commissioner Dubois observed was not coming from cooking fires. It was evidence of a feeding that would continue until Christmas morning delivered the ultimate demonstration of how Christian mercy could be transformed into Old Testament justice, and how the season of peace could become the moment when accumulated grievances finally demanded satisfaction. The machete gleamed in the firelight as Celeste cleaned it for the fourth time that evening, her educated hands steady despite what they had just finished. Blood leaves stains that go deeper than steel, marking not just the blade but the soul of the one who wields it. Once marked, there is no washing clean, only the choice between acknowledging what you have become or pretending that necessity has not transformed you into something that polite society would refuse to recognize. Understanding how ordinary people evolve into agents of systematic revenge matters because the conditions that created the Kabongos continue to exist wherever exploitation disguises itself as civilization, wherever systematic dehumanization hides behind legal frameworks, and wherever those in power convince themselves that their victims lack the intelligence, organization, or moral complexity to seek justice outside official channels. The rainy season of 1924 had been particularly brutal, even by Congo Basin standards. Precipitation fell in torrents that turned red clay roads into impassable rivers and isolated colonial settlements for weeks at a time. The Kabongo family found themselves cut off in their refuge near the abandoned copal works, watching their meager supplies dwindle while game disappeared deeper into the forests. But unlike other displaced families who might starve quietly or risk exposure by seeking help from colonial authorities, the Kabongos had neighbors, and their neighbors possessed things they needed. The decision to take what they required was not born from desperation alone, but from a cold calculation about which lives held value in a colonial system that had already declared them expendable. The crunch of wet leaves underfoot, the sharp bite of air thick with moisture that turned every breath into visible vapor, and the slick texture of surfaces coated with perpetual dampness marked the morning when Celeste made her first kill. Not in self-defense, not in sudden rage, but in calculated response to a world that had offered her family nothing but degradation disguised as Christian charity. Pastor Wilhelm Jansen was a Dutch Reformed missionary, one of the circuit preachers who brought Protestant salvation to remote areas where Catholic missions had not yet established permanent stations. He arrived at the abandoned copal works on December 3, 1924, seeking shelter from a sudden tropical storm that had caught him between settlements. What he found was a family that had moved beyond salvation into something that Protestant theology had no framework for understanding. From Pastor Jansen's final journal entry, dated December 3, 1924, encountered native family living in ruins of old resin works. The woman demonstrates remarkable education, speaking Dutch with grammatical precision that surpasses many Europeans of my acquaintance. Yet something in her manner suggests depths that missionary training never prepared me to fathom. Storm requires overnight shelter, though instinct counsels against accepting their hospitality. The storm lasted 4 days. Pastor Wilhelm Jansen did not emerge on the 5th. Celeste had been the first to suggest it, not through words but through the way she observed their unexpected guest as he slept beside their fire, clutching his leather satchel containing Bibles intended for distribution among communities that colonial authorities deemed ready for Christian instruction. Mathieu understood immediately what his wife was contemplating. This was not random misfortune delivering a stranger to their refuge. This was Providence offering exactly what they needed, a representative of the religious system that justified colonial exploitation through promises of eternal reward for temporal suffering. Helpless and dependent on their mercy, just as they had been helpless and dependent on his, the revenge tasted better than either had imagined it would. What happened to Pastor Jansen in that abandoned resin works established the methodology for everything that followed. The Kabongos did not simply kill their victims, they transformed their enemies into sustenance, both physical and spiritual, consuming not just flesh but the moral authority that had been used to justify their oppression. Each death fed not only their bodies but their growing conviction that they had discovered their true purpose in the colonial landscape. By December 1924, the family had consumed 6 travelers and begun making expeditions away from their forest refuge, not to seek employment or petition for official assistance but to hunt. They had recognized the limitation of their previous approach. Waiting for victims to arrive meant long periods without fresh meat and missed opportunities to select targets who deserved what they would receive. Marie, their daughter, proved most skilled at this evolved form of hunting. Her beauty had survived their years of hardship, and colonial men, both civilian and religious, remained susceptible to young native women who appeared to need European protection. She would approach isolated compounds with carefully prepared stories of being separated from her family, lost in the forest, desperate for Christian charity. The kindness of strangers, particularly strangers who viewed native women as objects for potential exploitation, became their primary source of both nourishment and information. But the Kabongos had developed appetites more sophisticated than simple survival required. They began selecting victims not merely for accessibility, but for symbolic value. missionaries who preached submission while living in comfort supported by native labor, colonial administrators who documented native inferiority while depending on native expertise, traders who accumulated wealth by manipulating traditional exchange systems that had operated fairly for generations. André, the eldest son, maintained a detailed record of their operations, written in the Dutch he had learned during his technical training. His handwriting, surprisingly sophisticated for someone colonial authorities would classify as barely literate, documented their evolution from desperate refugees into something far more dangerous than colonial imagination could conceive. From André Kabongo's journal, dated December 12, 1924, Mother instructs that we must exercise discrimination in our selection. Not any flesh will suffice for our purposes. It must derive from those who have earned their fate through systematic cruelty. The meat carries more satisfaction when justice provides the seasoning. Father agrees, though he expresses this truth differently, saying that some hungers demand feeding while others demand starving. The scattered colonial communities throughout the Sankuru Valley noticed the disappearances but attributed them to familiar dangers, tropical diseases that could kill within days, accidents along treacherous river crossings, attacks by wildlife that had learned to associate humans with easy prey. The colonial administrative system provided convenient explanations for those who preferred not to investigate uncomfortable possibilities about the people they had displaced from traditional lands. District Commissioner Laurent Dubois began connecting patterns that others missed or chose to ignore. 9 missing persons in 2 months, all healthy adults capable of surviving routine travel between settlements, all last seen traveling routes that passed near the forested areas where displaced communities had established unauthorized settlements, all from demographics that the colonial system classified as essential to regional economic development. What the commissioner could not have known was that the Kabongos had begun keeping trophies from their victims, not just personal belongings that might provide useful intelligence, but preserved portions of their enemies' flesh, prepared using traditional preservation techniques that Celeste had learned from her grandmother before colonization disrupted traditional knowledge transmission. They developed preferences, techniques and rituals around consumption that elevated simple cannibalism into something approaching religious communion. The family that had once begged for inclusion in colonial society now viewed themselves as judges, jury and executioners for a system that had created them through systematic brutality and abandonment. Their hunger had evolved beyond physical need into something that fed on the very foundations of the civilization that had rejected their humanity while demanding their labor. But their appetites were about to lead them toward a target that would transform their campaign from isolated incidents into a challenge that colonial authorities could not ignore or explain away. The Beaumont palm oil estate, where Mathieu had first encountered the specific cruelties that turned him from colonial subject into colonial nightmare, beckoned like an invitation to justice that Christmas morning would finally deliver. Part 2. Environmental context building. The Sankuru River Valley stretched between forested hills like a green scar across the heart of Belgian Congo, carrying the brown water that connected scattered settlements to the broader colonial economy. Morning vapors rose from the river's surface, carrying the rich scent of decomposing vegetation and the distant sound of dugout canoes cutting through water that had witnessed centuries of human movement long before European maps declared it discovered. The landscape bore the texture of forced transformation. Ancient baobab trees stood like monuments to pre-colonial memory, their massive trunks scarred with bullet holes from military expeditions that had pacified traditional resistance. Between these giants, neat rows of oil palms stretched toward horizons that promised escape but delivered only more systematic exploitation. The geometric precision of plantation agriculture imposed European order on African soil, creating wealth that flowed eastward across oceans to finance lifestyles that colonial subjects would never experience. Steam locomotives' whistle echoed across the valley each Tuesday and Friday, carrying palm oil and rubber toward ports that connected Congo's extracted wealth to global markets. The iron rails cut through communities that had existed for generations, dividing families and forcing traditional migration patterns to accommodate industrial schedules. Children learned to measure time not by seasonal changes or ceremonial cycles, but by the arrival of trains that carried away everything their parents produced and brought back nothing but increased quotas and administrative demands. The mission station of Saint-Pierre perched on a hill overlooking the river crossing, its stone chapel and wooden schoolhouse representing the spiritual dimension of colonial control. Bell towers that called faithful Christians to prayer also served as watchtowers for monitoring native movement across traditional territories. The cross that crowned the chapel cast shadows that fell across burial grounds where traditional ancestors rested uneasily beneath foreign symbols of salvation that required abandoning indigenous spiritual practices. Colonial architecture throughout the valley followed patterns designed to demonstrate European superiority through visual contrast. The Beaumont Estate's main house rose 3 stories above ground level, its white-painted walls and red tile roof visible from settlements where native workers lived in single-room structures built from local materials that emphasized temporary status. Wide verandas with ornate railings provided elevated platforms for observing labor in the palm groves, transforming domestic space into instruments of surveillance and control. Administrative buildings in Luluabourg featured the same deliberate grandeur, with marble imported from Belgium and hardwood floors that required constant maintenance from native servants. Telegraph offices connected colonial administrators to Brussels through copper wires that carried messages about production statistics, labor efficiency and native unrest. The communication networks that enabled imperial control also created vulnerabilities that few Europeans understood, particularly when literate natives gained access to the information flowing through systems designed to exclude them. The workers' quarters that housed families like the Kabongos reflected colonial assumptions about native social organization and space requirements. Rectangular structures arranged in military precision replaced traditional circular compounds that had fostered community interaction. Narrow windows and single entrances facilitated monitoring while preventing private gatherings that might foster resistance planning. The architecture of oppression shaped daily life in ways that few Europeans recognized but every Congolese family experienced as psychological pressure that complemented physical coercion. Natural geography provided both obstacles and opportunities for those seeking to resist colonial control. Dense forest areas between settlements offered concealment for unauthorized movement, while river systems enabled transportation that avoided official checkpoints. The abandoned industrial sites scattered throughout the valley, remnants of earlier extraction efforts that had moved to more profitable locations, provided shelter for displaced communities that official records no longer acknowledged as existing. Traditional hunting trails wound through forests that colonial maps showed as empty wilderness, connecting communities through networks that predated European arrival by centuries. These paths carried information, supplies, and people beyond administrative oversight, creating parallel systems of communication and exchange that colonial authorities struggled to monitor or control. Knowledge of these routes represented power that could be turned against the systems that had created the need for their secrecy. The climate itself became an instrument of colonial control, with European managers retreating to elevated compounds during the humid months when tropical diseases claimed lives that administrative records classified as acceptable losses. Native workers remained in the palm groves and processing facilities, their bodies considered more expendable than the mechanical equipment that required careful maintenance and expensive replacement. The seasonal patterns of illness and death created predictable labor shortages that colonial administrators addressed through increased forced recruitment rather than improved working conditions. Weather patterns that traditional communities had understood for generations became unpredictable under colonial land use practices that prioritized short-term extraction over ecological sustainability. Deforestation for palm oil cultivation altered local rainfall patterns, while intensive agriculture depleted soil nutrients that had sustained traditional farming for centuries. The environmental destruction that accompanied colonial development created new forms of vulnerability that affected native communities more severely than European settlements. Sound carried differently in the transformed landscape, with industrial noise from processing facilities disrupting traditional communication patterns that had relied on drum networks and natural acoustics. The constant mechanical humming of palm oil presses and rubber processing equipment masked movements that would have been audible in the pre-colonial environment. These changes created new opportunities for stealth and concealment that some displaced families learned to exploit for purposes that colonial authorities never anticipated. Market towns that had developed around traditional trade routes found themselves bypassed by railway lines that connected production areas directly to export facilities. Traditional economic relationships between communities withered as colonial currency replaced barter systems and administrative regulations restricted movement between ethnic territories. The destruction of indigenous commerce created new forms of dependence that made resistance more difficult while simultaneously providing motivations for more desperate forms of opposition. Part 3. Character, origin and foundation. Matu Kabongo possessed hands that remembered freedom even after 15 years of forced labor had reshaped them into tools for extracting wealth that would never benefit his family. His fingers bore the permanent stains of palm oil and rubber latex, marks that colonial managers viewed as evidence of industrial efficiency but that represented the physical transformation of human beings into mechanical components of extraction systems designed to enrich distant Europeans. Born during the reign of Masiri, the traditional ruler whose territory became Belgian Congo through military conquest and diplomatic manipulation, Matu had witnessed the systematic destruction of political structures that had governed his people for generations. His childhood memories included traditional ceremonies that celebrated seasonal cycles and community achievements, practices that colonial administrators subsequently banned as primitive superstitions incompatible with Christian civilization and industrial productivity. Traditional education had prepared him for adult responsibilities that colonization rendered obsolete overnight. His training in hunting, tracking, and understanding animal behavior provided skills that became valuable in unexpected ways once colonial rule made traditional subsistence impossible. Knowledge of forest geography, weather patterns, and seasonal migration routes would eventually serve purposes that his traditional teachers never anticipated when they shared wisdom intended to sustain community life. The transition from traditional society to colonial subject began gradually, with administrative demands that initially appeared reasonable to communities that had always paid tribute to political authorities. Taxation and colonial currency required engagement with wage labor systems that drew men away from traditional economic activities. Road construction projects that colonial authorities described as infrastructure development separated families for months while requiring uncompensated labor that benefited only administrative and commercial interests. Military recruitment for colonial expeditions against resistant communities forced traditional enemies to fight alongside each other under European command, creating psychological trauma that extended beyond physical violence to include complicity in the destruction of cultural independence. Matu served 2 years in colonial forces that pacified regions where traditional rulers attempted to maintain autonomy through armed resistance, experiences that taught him European military tactics while forcing him to participate in the destruction of political systems that resembled his own. Marriage to Celeste represented an attempt to maintain traditional social bonds within colonial constraints that made traditional marriage practices difficult or impossible. Colonial administrators required documentation for relationships that traditional society had recognized through community ceremony and family agreement. The bureaucratic requirements for legal marriage created dependencies on colonial institutions that gradually replaced traditional forms of social organization with systems designed to serve administrative convenience. Celeste's education at the mission station of Saint-Pierre provided skills that traditional women's education had not included, particularly literacy in European languages and familiarity with colonial administrative procedures. Her ability to read contracts, interpret official documents, and understand legal terminology gave the family access to information that most native communities could not obtain independently. This knowledge would prove crucial when legal channels for addressing grievances repeatedly failed to provide justice or protection. The mission school curriculum combined Christian religious instruction with practical training designed to produce native assistance for colonial administration. Celeste learned bookkeeping, basic medical procedures, and domestic management techniques that prepared her for employment in European households or colonial institutions. However, her education also provided access to European political and philosophical ideas that mission authorities had not intended to share with native students who were expected to accept subordinate positions without questioning the systems that maintained their subordination. Andre's mechanical aptitude emerged during childhood play with traditional tools and weapons, skills that colonial technical training developed into expertise with industrial equipment and communication systems. His understanding of mechanical principles made him valuable for maintaining telegraph equipment and processing machinery, but also provided knowledge of how to disable or sabotage systems that had become instruments of oppression rather than community development. Pierre's physical strength and endurance qualified him for the most demanding forms of colonial labor, but these same attributes also made him valuable for activities that required sustained physical effort under dangerous conditions. His experience with construction projects and infrastructure development taught him about weak points in colonial installations while building the physical capacity needed for operations that would require both strength and stamina. Marie's beauty attracted attention from colonial men who viewed native women as sexual objects available for exploitation, but her intelligence and education enabled her to understand and manipulate these attitudes for purposes that her would-be exploiters never suspected. Her knowledge of European social customs and domestic routines provided intelligence about potential targets, while her apparent vulnerability offered tactical advantages that could be exploited by family members with more violent intentions. Family discussions conducted in traditional languages that few Europeans understood allowed planning and coordination that remained invisible to colonial authorities, who assumed that native conversations involved only immediate practical concerns. The linguistic privacy that traditional languages provided became increasingly valuable as colonial surveillance expanded to monitor native communities for signs of resistance or unauthorized organization. Religious instruction at the mission had introduced Christian concepts of justice and retribution that resonated with traditional beliefs about reciprocity and moral balance, but mission authorities had not anticipated how thoroughly educated natives might apply these principles to colonial relationships that violated every standard of Christian behavior that missionaries claimed to represent. The theological contradictions between Christian teaching and colonial practice provided intellectual framework for resistance that mission education had unintentionally supplied. Traditional spiritual practices that families maintained secretly alongside obligatory Christian observance included concepts of justice that required active response to systematic injury rather than passive acceptance of injustice as divine will. These beliefs provided moral justification for actions that Christian doctrine would condemn, creating psychological authorization for revenge that European theological training had not equipped colonial authorities to recognize or counter. Economic knowledge gained through traditional trading relationships and colonial employment provided understanding of how colonial wealth extraction functioned and where it remained vulnerable to disruption. Matou's work in palm oil processing had revealed the complete dependence of colonial profits on native labor that received minimal compensation while generating enormous wealth for European investors who never set foot in Congo. Part 4: The Cycle of Systematic Oppression. The pattern revealed itself with mathematical precision across 4 years of attempted integration into colonial society, each iteration following the same devastating sequence that characterized European attitudes toward educated natives who possessed skills that colonial administrators needed but refused to respect. Initial tolerance masked contempt that emerged whenever native competence challenged assumptions about racial hierarchy that justified the entire colonial enterprise. The first position at the Beaumont Estate had promised advancement opportunities that existed only in recruitment conversations designed to attract skilled workers during labor shortages. Matou's expertise with traditional palm oil extraction exceeded European technical knowledge, but colonial managers could not acknowledge native superiority without undermining the racial justifications for political domination. His innovations that increased production efficiency were credited to European supervision, while his attempts to improve working conditions were dismissed as native incompetence regarding industrial requirements. Accusations of theft emerged whenever native workers demonstrated independence or questioned procedures that prioritized profit over safety. Colonial managers understood that maintaining discipline required periodic examples that reminded native employees of their expendable status within systems designed to extract maximum labor at minimum cost. Matou's public whipping for allegedly stealing palm oil that he had actually improved through traditional processing techniques served multiple purposes that had nothing to do with actual theft. The humiliation was calculated to destroy his credibility among other native workers while demonstrating European authority to resolve disputes through violence rather than investigation. Colonial justice operated on assumptions that native testimony was inherently unreliable, while European accusations required no corroborating evidence beyond the racial hierarchy that made white claims automatically more credible than black denials. Demotion to field labor followed standard procedures for managing native workers who had exceeded their designated positions within colonial hierarchy. Europeans could not allow natives to occupy supervisory roles that might suggest racial equality regardless of competence or qualifications. The palm groves became his prison, where brutal labor under tropical sun served as both punishment and warning to other workers who might consider challenging European management decisions. The second attempt at mission work initially appeared more promising because religious institutions claimed moral standards that should have prevented the worst forms of colonial exploitation. Father Rousseau's genuine commitment to Christian principles created temporary protection for families that could contribute to evangelical work among traditional communities that remained resistant to European religious influence. Matou's knowledge of traditional customs provided access to communities that had rejected previous missionary efforts, while Celeste's education enabled her to serve as translator for religious discussions that required sensitivity to cultural differences. Their success at converting traditional leaders to Christianity brought recognition from mission authorities and temporary improvement in living conditions for their family. However, missionary success that disrupted established relationships between colonial administrators and traditional authorities created political problems that religious considerations could not override. Traditional chiefs who converted to Christianity began questioning colonial practices that violated Christian principles, particularly forced labor requirements and arbitrary taxation that impoverished native communities while enriching European administrators. The colonial government's response to religious challenges to administrative authority followed established patterns for dealing with native resistance. Accusations of sedition provided legal justification for removing troublesome individuals from positions where they could influence other natives toward unacceptable ideas about justice, equality, or political rights that colonial law reserved exclusively for Europeans. Expulsion from mission grounds eliminated their protection while creating precedent that discouraged other religious institutions from harboring natives who had demonstrated dangerous independence. The collaboration between colonial administration and religious authorities revealed the ultimate subordination of Christian principles to colonial political requirements whenever conflicts arose between spiritual and administrative considerations. The third opportunity in Luluabourg represented their most successful integration into colonial society, where technical skills commanded respect that transcended racial prejudices to some degree. The expanding telegraph system required workers who combined mechanical aptitude with reliability, qualifications that made competent natives temporarily valuable despite their racial classification. Andre's mechanical abilities impressed European supervisors who needed skilled assistance for maintaining communication equipment that connected administrative centers to military installations and commercial operations. Pierre's physical capabilities qualified him for construction work that required strength, endurance, and familiarity with local materials and working conditions that European laborers could not match. Marie's domestic employment in administrative households provided steady income while offering insights into European social customs and decision-making processes that most native families never observed directly. Her position as house servant created opportunities for overhearing conversations about colonial policies and administrative problems that could prove valuable for family planning and risk assessment. The stability lasted nearly a year longer than previous attempts at integration, creating hope that education and competence might eventually overcome racial barriers that limited native advancement within colonial systems. The family began planning long-term goals that assumed continued employment and gradual improvement in social status through demonstrated reliability and skill development. The accusation of sabotage that destroyed their security followed familiar patterns of colonial paranoia about native loyalty during periods of technical problems that European managers could not easily explain. Telegraph equipment failures that resulted from inadequate maintenance and harsh environmental conditions required scapegoats who could be blamed without acknowledging European technical incompetence or administrative negligence. Andre's imprisonment without trial demonstrated the complete absence of legal protection for natives accused of crimes against colonial infrastructure. European testimony about suspicious behavior and opportunity provided sufficient evidence for conviction under colonial legal systems that excluded native witnesses and ignored evidence that contradicted predetermined conclusions about native guilt. The family's expulsion from administrative areas followed collective punishment principles that held all native associates responsible for alleged crimes committed by any individual member. Colonial authorities understood that isolated punishment was less effective than community consequences that created social pressure for self-policing within native populations that might otherwise shelter potential troublemakers. Part 5: Psychological Transformation Triggers. The abandoned Copal Works near Devil's Bend on the Sankuru River represented more than geographical refuge for a family that had exhausted legal options for survival within colonial society. The ruins of previous extraction efforts provided physical shelter, but more importantly, they offered psychological space for contemplating alternatives to accommodation with systems designed to exploit their labor while denying their humanity. Traditional spiritual practices that the family had maintained secretly throughout their attempts at colonial integration provided conceptual frameworks for understanding their situation in terms that European Christianity could not address. Ancestor veneration included obligations to respond to systematic injustice that threatened family survival and community continuity, responsibilities that Christian doctrine of passive acceptance could not override without violating deeper spiritual commitments. Celesta's education had introduced her to European political philosophy through mission library access that authorities had not restricted because they assumed native women would focus on domestic and religious materials rather than works that discussed revolutionary concepts. Her reading of texts about natural rights, social contracts, and justified resistance to tyrannical government provided intellectual justification for actions that mission training had been designed to prevent. The systematic nature of their oppression became clear through comparison of their experiences with stories shared by other displaced families who had attempted integration into colonial society through different approaches. Every strategy for accommodation failed according to the same patterns that revealed deliberate colonial policies rather than individual prejudices or unfortunate circumstances that education or good behavior might eventually overcome. European documents that Celesta could read but most natives could not access revealed the theoretical foundations of colonial policy that explicitly stated goals of maintaining racial hierarchy through economic dependence and political exclusion. Colonial administrators openly discussed strategies for preventing native advancement that might challenge assumptions about European superiority that justified the entire imperial enterprise. Traditional knowledge about hunting and warfare that Matthew had learned during his youth provided tactical frameworks that could be adapted for purposes his teachers had never anticipated. Traditional combat emphasized patience, understanding of prey behavior, and exploitation of environmental advantages, principles that applied equally well to hunting animals or humans who had made themselves enemies through systematic cruelty. The technical training that André and Pierre had received included knowledge about vulnerabilities in communication systems, transportation networks, and industrial facilities that colonial security had not been designed to protect against sabotage by educated natives who understood their operational requirements. European assumptions about native incompetence created security gaps that knowledgeable natives could exploit if they abandoned accommodation strategies. Marie's experience with European domestic routines provided detailed intelligence about personal habits, daily schedules, and security practices that colonial families followed in their private spaces. Her attractiveness, which had initially made her vulnerable to sexual exploitation, could become a tactical advantage if redirected toward purposes that European men would never suspect from native women they viewed as objects rather than agents. The isolation at Devil's Bend eliminated external constraints that had previously limited family discussions to topics that colonial society considered appropriate for native conversations. Traditional languages that few Europeans understood allowed planning conversations that could not be overheard, while geographic remoteness prevented surveillance that had made resistance planning impossible in colonial settlements. Hunger that had been constant throughout their years of colonial employment became acute during their isolation, but it also clarified priorities that accommodation strategies had obscured. Physical hunger could be satisfied through hunting and gathering that traditional skills made possible, but spiritual hunger for justice and recognition of their humanity required responses that traditional society had prepared them to provide. Traditional concepts of reciprocity demanded responses to systematic injury that restored moral balance through actions proportionate to the harm that had been inflicted. Colonial exploitation that had stolen years of their lives and destroyed their hopes for advancement within legal systems required responses that colonial law would condemn but traditional justice would recognize as necessary restoration of equilibrium. The technical knowledge that colonial education had provided could be combined with traditional skills to create capabilities that neither system had intended to produce. Mechanical expertise merged with hunting knowledge, literacy combined with spiritual practices, and domestic intelligence integrated with traditional warfare concepts to create tactical possibilities that colonial security assumptions had not anticipated. Family bonds that colonial employment had strained through separation and competing demands became stronger during isolation that allowed traditional relationship patterns to reassert themselves. Shared suffering and common enemies created unity of purpose that colonial integration had threatened through individual opportunities that might have divided family loyalties. Religious instruction that had emphasized forgiveness and acceptance could be reinterpreted through traditional concepts of justice that required action rather than passive endurance. Christian concepts of divine retribution could be understood as requiring human agency to implement heavenly justice on earth rather than waiting for posthumous rewards that might never come. The moral authority that colonial society claimed through Christian civilization could be challenged by demonstrating how thoroughly colonial practices violated every principle that missionaries claimed to represent. European hypocrisy that preached love, while practicing exploitation, created moral justification for responses that held Christians accountable to their own stated standards through methods that Christian theology might condemn, but Christian behavior had made necessary. Environmental knowledge that traditional education had provided included understanding of seasonal patterns, weather cycles, and natural resources that could support extended operations beyond colonial oversight. The forest that sheltered them could also conceal activities that colonial security forces would be unable to detect or prevent. if conducted by people who understood terrain better than their potential pursuers. Traditional medicine that included knowledge of plants that could heal or harm provided resources that colonial pharmacology could not match or counter. Hunting techniques that had been developed for capturing animals could be adapted for human prey, who had made themselves legitimate targets through systematic cruelty that traditional justice recognized as capital crimes deserving death. Part 6. First manifestation of change. The putrid sweetness of rotting mangoes mixed with the acrid smoke of charcoal fires drifted across the Sankuru River on that November morning in 1924, when colonial authorities first noticed the pattern of disappearances that would transform regional security assessments. The heavy scent of tropical decay masked other odors that European noses could not identify, stenches that spoke of transformations occurring beyond the boundaries of civilized understanding. Dr. François Delacroix vanished first, somewhere between the mission station of Saint-Pierre and the remote medical clinic he operated near the Crocodile Crossing. His monthly supply run followed established routes that connected scattered settlements through river paths and forest trails that colonial maps marked but European feet rarely traveled. The Belgian physician had spent 7 years treating tropical diseases among native populations, earning respect that transcended racial boundaries through competence that saved lives regardless of skin color. His disappearance on November 3, 1924, created immediate concern among colonial administrators who understood the strategic value of medical personnel willing to work in remote areas where European mortality rates discouraged voluntary service. District Commissioner Laurent Dubois organized search parties that followed standard protocols for locating missing Europeans, assuming that accident, illness, or hostile wildlife explained the absence of a man whose medical knowledge should have protected him from most tropical dangers. The search teams discovered Delacroix's dugout canoe overturned near Devil's Bend, its medical supplies scattered along the riverbank in patterns that suggested hasty evacuation rather than systematic looting. Personal belongings remained untouched, including currency and trade goods that native thieves would have valued, while only medical instruments and pharmaceutical supplies had been removed with selective precision that indicated specific knowledge about their potential uses. Colonial authorities attributed the disappearance to crocodile attack, a convenient explanation that required no investigation of uncomfortable possibilities about native resistance or organized criminal activity. Crocodiles left no bodies to examine, no witnesses to question, no evidence that might complicate administrative reports that Brussels expected to confirm continued European control over interior regions. The second disappearance challenged crocodile theories without providing alternative explanations that colonial imagination could readily accept. Brother Marcus van der Berg, a Flemish lay missionary who operated a small clinic near the abandoned Copal Works, vanished on November 12 while returning from a baptism ceremony in the village of Kananga. His evangelical work among traditional communities had earned grudging respect from colonial administrators who valued religious influence that encouraged native acceptance of European authority. His personal effects were discovered 3 days later, arranged in careful patterns around a burned-out cooking fire deep in the forest near the ruins where he had been conducting unauthorized religious services for displaced families who lacked access to established missions. The arrangement suggested ritualistic significance that European observers could not interpret, though traditional symbology would have recognized markers of judgment and spiritual transformation. The cooking fire had burned far longer and hotter than necessary for preparing normal meals, leaving residue that included fragments of cloth, leather and other materials that might have been personal belongings or something else entirely. Colonial investigators lacked the cultural knowledge to interpret the evidence properly, while native witnesses claimed ignorance about ceremonies they would have understood perfectly if conducted for traditional purposes rather than colonial ones. Thomas Beaumont, younger brother of plantation owner Charles Beaumont, disappeared on November 18 during a hunting expedition that was supposed to demonstrate European mastery over African wilderness to visiting investors from Brussels. His hunting party included 3 native guides who returned to the plantation with stories about strange sounds, unusual smoke patterns and tracking signs that suggested human predators rather than animal threats. The native guides described finding Beaumont's rifle abandoned beside a stream where human footprints indicated struggle, ambush, and systematic removal of evidence that might identify the attackers. The guides themselves displayed psychological symptoms that European observers interpreted as superstitious fear, but that actually reflected recognition of traditional warfare techniques adapted for purposes that violated customary limitations on legitimate violence. District Commissioner Dubois noticed patterns that other colonial authorities missed or dismissed as coincidental: 3 disappearances in 15 days, all involving Europeans who worked closely with native populations in remote areas where colonial security was minimal. All victims had demonstrated competence that earned native respect while maintaining European authority through professional expertise, rather than racial intimidation alone. The geographic pattern revealed tactical sophistication that challenged assumptions about native capacity for coordinated planning. Each disappearance occurred near river crossings or forest paths that connected isolated settlements to major transportation routes, suggesting knowledge of colonial movement patterns and systematic surveillance of European activities in areas where traditional security measures were impractical. Most disturbing were reports from native communities about unusual activities in forest areas that colonial authorities had assumed were uninhabited. Travelers mentioned smoke rising from locations where no authorized settlements existed, cooking fires that burned with inappropriate intensity, and sounds that resembled traditional ceremonies but included elements that violated customary practices regarding spiritual observance and community participation. Overseer Willem van der Berg, Thomas Beaumont's cousin and manager of secondary processing operations at the palm oil estate, organized private security patrols that attempted to track the source of these unusual activities. His search teams discovered evidence of habitation near the abandoned copal works, including recently constructed shelters, food storage areas, and tool caches that indicated permanent settlement by individuals with access to both traditional and European technologies. The evidence suggested a community of displaced natives who possessed skills that standard colonial education had not provided, indicating either traditional knowledge that official ethnographic studies had missed or European training that had been applied to unauthorized purposes. The combination of traditional forest survival techniques with industrial equipment created capabilities that colonial security planning had not anticipated. Private security operations that van der Berg conducted without official authorization revealed the extent of unauthorized native organization in areas that administrative records classified as uninhabited wilderness. Well-maintained trails connected hidden settlements through communication networks that enabled coordination across distances that should have prevented organized resistance activities. The tools and equipment discovered in these hidden settlements included items that had disappeared from colonial installations over previous months, suggesting systematic theft or salvage operations that had remained undetected because European managers had attributed missing materials to normal wastage, administrative inefficiency, or native incompetence rather than organized acquisition for specific purposes. Traditional weapons modified with European materials created armaments that combined indigenous military knowledge with colonial manufacturing techniques to produce equipment that was both familiar and unfamiliar to European military experience. Spears with steel points, hunting bows reinforced with industrial materials, and traditional traps enhanced with European components suggested tactical innovation that standard counterinsurgency planning had not considered. Most concerning were indications that these hidden communities included individuals with European military training, possibly deserters from colonial forces or natives who had acquired combat experience during previous military campaigns against resistant traditional authorities. The combination of European tactical knowledge with traditional guerrilla techniques created operational capabilities that conventional colonial security forces were not equipped to address. By late November, District Commissioner Dubois had begun to suspect that the disappearances represented systematic attacks rather than random accidents or opportunistic crime. However, his superiors in Brussels preferred explanations that did not require increased military expenditure or acknowledgement that colonial control over interior regions was less complete than administrative reports had claimed. Official response to the disappearances followed established protocols for managing native unrest while avoiding publicity that might discourage European investment or immigration. Increased security patrols, restrictions on native movement, and enhanced surveillance of traditional gatherings addressed symptoms while ignoring underlying causes that would require fundamental changes to colonial policies. The bureaucratic response created additional grievances among native populations who were subjected to collective punishment for crimes that few understood and none had committed through normal criminal activity. Traditional communities that had previously maintained neutral relationships with colonial authorities found themselves treated as potential enemies because geographic proximity made them convenient targets for administrative action that appeared decisive while avoiding direct confrontation with actual threats. Part 7. Ideological crystallization of the bone needle pierced flesh with surgical precision as Celeste completed the scarification ritual that would mark her transformation from colonial subject to something that European anthropology had no terminology for describing. The traditional patterns carved into her shoulders carried meanings that mission education had taught her to deny, but isolation had revealed as essential for spiritual preparation that Christian theology could not provide. Sacred geometry that her grandmother had explained during childhood visits now served purposes that traditional society had never contemplated. The raised scars would identify her to ancestors whose judgment mattered more than European legal systems that refused to acknowledge native humanity while demanding native labor. Spiritual protection that traditional religion provided required physical markers that demonstrated commitment to values that colonization had attempted to destroy. The ritual cleansing that preceded scarification included fasting that purified not just the body but the intentions that would guide future actions beyond the boundaries of civilized behavior. European concepts of morality assumed spiritual frameworks that colonization had systematically undermined, creating moral vacuums that traditional practices could refill if applied to purposes that traditional society had never needed to consider. André and Pierre underwent parallel initiations that prepared them for adult responsibilities that traditional society had defined differently, but that current circumstances required them to reinterpret according to necessity rather than custom. Traditional manhood included obligations to protect family and community through methods that colonial law prohibited, but that spiritual law required when legal systems failed to provide justice or security. The scarification ceremony that marked their passage into active resistance included elements borrowed from traditional military initiation that prepared warriors for conflicts where survival depended on psychological preparation as much as physical training. European military instruction had provided tactical knowledge, but traditional spiritual practices supplied psychological resilience that would be necessary for operations that violated European moral frameworks. Marie's initiation involved different rituals that prepared her for roles that traditional women's societies had never contemplated but that current circumstances made necessary for family survival. Her scarification patterns identified her as committed to purposes that would require her to violate European expectations about native women's behavior while maintaining appearances that would enable tactical deception. Traditional concepts of justice that had governed inter-community conflicts provided frameworks for understanding colonial relationships in terms that demanded active response rather than passive acceptance. European exploitation that had exceeded traditional limits for legitimate warfare required responses that traditional military ethics would recognize as appropriate even if colonial law condemned them as criminal. The spiritual consultation that preceded their campaign involved communication with ancestors through traditional practices that mission education had forbidden but that isolation allowed them to resume without fear of European interference. Ancestral guidance provided moral authorization for actions that Christian doctrine condemned but that traditional justice recognized as necessary restoration of spiritual balance. Traditional religious concepts that emphasized reciprocity and moral equilibrium demanded responses to systematic injury that restored balance through actions proportionate to the harm that had been inflicted. Colonial exploitation that had stolen years of their lives while destroying their hopes for legal advancement required responses that colonial law would condemn but that traditional justice would recognize as divinely mandated. The philosophical framework that emerged from combining traditional spiritual practices with European political education created ideological justification for resistance methods that neither system alone could have authorized. European concepts of natural rights merged with traditional concepts of spiritual obligation to create moral imperatives that transcended both Christian ethics and customary limitations on legitimate violence. Traditional concepts of spiritual pollution that resulted from unavenged injury required purification through actions that restored moral cleanliness to individuals and communities that had been contaminated by systematic oppression. European civilization that claimed moral superiority while practicing systematic cruelty had created spiritual pollution that demanded cleansing through methods that European theology could not acknowledge without undermining colonial justifications. The decision to move beyond survival into active resistance followed spiritual logic that required family members to demonstrate worthiness for ancestral protection through actions that proved their commitment to values that colonization had attempted to destroy. Passive acceptance of systematic injury would violate spiritual obligations to ancestors who had fought and died to preserve community independence. Sacred obligations to future generations required present actions that would prevent the complete destruction of traditional values and social structures that colonial education was designed to eliminate. Resistance that seemed criminal to European law represented spiritual necessity for people whose cultural survival depended on maintaining connections to traditional sources of meaning and identity. Traditional concepts of leadership that emphasized responsibility for community welfare required family heads to take actions that protected not just immediate relatives but extended community networks that colonization had fragmented but not completely destroyed. The isolated families scattered throughout the forest region represented communities that traditional leadership obligations required them to protect through whatever methods proved necessary. European concepts of property rights that justified colonial exploitation could be challenged through traditional concepts of stewardship that emphasized reciprocal obligations between people and land that colonization had violated through systematic environmental destruction. Restoration of proper relationships between people and environment required removal of colonial systems that prioritized extraction over sustainability. The theological contradictions between Christian teaching and colonial practice provided intellectual justification for actions that mission education had been designed to prevent. European hypocrisy that preached love while practicing systematic hatred created moral authorization for responses that held Christians accountable to their own stated principles through methods that Christian behavior had made necessary. Traditional medicine that included knowledge of poisonous plants and toxic preparations could be redirected toward purposes that traditional society had reserved for extreme circumstances involving threats to community survival. Colonial oppression that threatened cultural extinction qualified as extreme circumstances that justified methods that normal social relationships would prohibit. Traditional concepts of hospitality that required protection for guests could be reinterpreted to justify protection for community members through elimination of threats that legal systems refused to address. European visitors who had abused traditional hospitality through systematic exploitation could legitimately be denied further protection through traditional institutions that they had violated. Part 8. Methodical implementation. The morning dew clung to spiderwebs stretched between palm fronds like nature's own telegraph lines carrying messages that only those who understood forest communication could decipher. Each droplet caught the early light and reflected it back toward the main house of the Beaumont Estate, where European routines proceeded with clockwork precision that made surveillance and planning possible for observers who understood the rhythms of colonial domestic life. Dr. François Delacroix had approached the abandoned Copal Works on November 3 with medical supplies intended for families that official records no longer acknowledged as existing within administrative boundaries. His humanitarian intentions had been genuine, motivated by Christian principles that his medical training reinforced through daily contact with suffering that colonial policies created but could not address through bureaucratic procedures. The physician's knowledge of tropical diseases and treatment protocols made him valuable to communities that colonial medical services ignored or actively avoided due to racial policies that prioritized European health over native welfare. His monthly visits to unauthorized settlements represented the only professional medical care available to displaced families who had been driven from official communities through administrative harassment or economic pressure. Celeste had observed his approach through traditional surveillance techniques that utilized forest knowledge to remain invisible while gathering intelligence about potential targets. His medical bag contained pharmaceutical supplies that traditional medicine could not duplicate, while his European status provided access to colonial facilities that native communities could not approach without risking arrest or forced relocation. The ambush site had been selected after careful study of his travel patterns using traditional hunting knowledge to identify locations where terrain advantages would prevent escape while minimizing risk of discovery by other colonial personnel. The river crossing near Devil's Bend provided natural concealment while offering multiple escape routes that traditional forest knowledge could utilize if complications arose. Traditional hunting techniques that had been developed for capturing large animals required minimal adaptation for human prey who lacked forest knowledge and wilderness survival skills that would have made them more dangerous opponents. European confidence in technological superiority created overconfidence that traditional tactical knowledge could exploit through patient observation and careful planning. The psychological preparation that preceded their first human hunt included traditional rituals that prepared warriors for killing that violated normal social boundaries while maintaining spiritual protection that would prevent contamination from taking life outside legitimate warfare contexts. Traditional society had developed psychological techniques for managing the spiritual consequences of necessary violence. Delacroix's medical knowledge had made him particularly valuable as initial prey because his death would deprive colonial communities of services they could not easily replace while providing his killers with medical supplies and pharmaceutical knowledge that could be used for future operations. Traditional concepts of warfare emphasized capturing enemy resources while denying them to opponents. The killing itself had been conducted according to traditional techniques that ensured rapid death while preserving spiritual purification that traditional religion required for warriors who took life in legitimate defense of community interests. European medical training had taught him anatomy that made precise application of traditional killing methods more efficient than customary practices required. Traditional butchering techniques that had been developed for processing large game animals required minimal modification for human prey, though spiritual preparation was more complex because taking human life involved obligations to ancestors that animal hunting did not require. Traditional society had developed specific rituals for managing the spiritual consequences of killing other humans in warfare contexts. The preservation of useful materials followed traditional practices for utilizing every portion of killed animals while adapting European butchering knowledge to maximize efficiency in processing human prey for consumption and material usage. European anatomy training had provided knowledge that made traditional preservation techniques more effective for human subjects than animal subjects. Medical instruments that had been recovered from Delacroix's equipment provided tools that traditional medicine could not duplicate, while pharmaceutical supplies offered treatment options for tropical diseases that traditional remedies could not address effectively. European medical knowledge could be combined with traditional healing practices to create therapeutic capabilities that neither system provided independently. The cooking techniques that had been developed for traditional feast preparation required adaptation for human flesh that had different nutritional and textural properties than animal meat, though basic preparation principles remained consistent with traditional culinary knowledge. European cooking methods that had been observed during domestic service could be combined with traditional techniques to improve palatability and nutritional value. Consumption of their first human victim had provided both physical nutrition and psychological satisfaction that exceeded expectations based on traditional accounts of ritualistic cannibalism in warfare contexts. The spiritual dimension of consuming enemies who had committed systematic crimes against community welfare created psychological effects that traditional practices had not fully anticipated. Brother Marcus van der Burg had been selected as their second target because his religious work among displaced communities provided access to intelligence about colonial security measures, while his missionary status offered less immediate military significance than medical personnel. His evangelical activities had created opportunities for surveillance that his religious commitment prevented him from recognizing as dangerous. The ambush techniques that had proven successful against medical personnel required modification for religious targets who possessed different vulnerabilities and different defensive capabilities. Missionary work had provided van der Burg with more extensive knowledge of local geography and traditional practices than medical work had given Delacroix, making him more dangerous prey despite his religious rather than military training. Traditional concepts of spiritual warfare that had governed conflicts between religious systems provided frameworks for understanding missionary activity as legitimate military target that threatened community spiritual welfare through systematic destruction of traditional religious practices. Christian evangelism represented spiritual warfare that traditional religious obligations required them to counter through appropriate methods. Religious education that had taught traditional communities about Christian theology could be reversed to identify vulnerabilities in Christian spiritual practices that traditional spiritual warfare could exploit. European religious confidence created psychological weak points that traditional spiritual knowledge could attack through methods that Christian training had not prepared missionaries to recognize or counter. The butchering and consumption of their second victim had provided additional confirmation that their campaign represented legitimate spiritual warfare rather than criminal activity, though European law would classify their actions as murder regardless of traditional justifications or spiritual authorizations that traditional society would recognize as valid. Part 9. Operational Sophistication. The metallic tang of brass cartridges mixed with the sweet corruption of rotting fruit as André cleaned the European rifle they had acquired from Thomas Beaumont's hunting expedition, each component disassembled with mechanical precision that colonial technical training had made possible. The weapon represented more than improved firepower. It symbolized the transformation of European tools into instruments of European destruction, turning colonial education against its intended purposes. Traditional weapons maintenance had emphasized preservation and care that extended equipment lifespan through techniques passed down through generations of hunters and warriors. European mechanical training had introduced concepts of systematic maintenance and modification that could be applied to traditional weapons while adapting European equipment to purposes its manufacturers had never intended to serve. The hunting party that had claimed Thomas Beaumont's life had demonstrated tactical sophistication that exceeded traditional ambush techniques through incorporation of European military knowledge with indigenous guerrilla methods. Traditional hunting strategies had been enhanced with modern understanding of ballistics, communication, and coordinated movement that colonial military service had taught André and Pierre during their required service periods. European hunting expeditions followed predictable patterns that traditional tracking knowledge could anticipate and exploit, particularly when European hunters relied on native guides whose loyalty colonial administrators assumed but never verified. Thomas Beaumont's confidence in native subservience had prevented him from recognizing signs of surveillance and planning that traditional forest knowledge could conduct invisibly. The psychological preparation that had preceded their third human hunt included traditional ceremonies that honored the spirits of prey animals while acknowledging the spiritual significance of taking human life in legitimate warfare. European military training had provided tactical knowledge, but traditional spiritual practices supplied psychological frameworks for managing the emotional consequences of systematic killing. Marie's role in operational planning had evolved beyond simple reconnaissance to include sophisticated intelligence gathering that utilized her employment in colonial households to obtain information about European personal habits, security practices, and communication patterns. Traditional women's roles in warfare had included intelligence functions that colonial assumptions about native women's capabilities failed to recognize. Domestic service that had initially represented economic necessity had become instrumental for gathering intelligence about European vulnerabilities that traditional warfare could exploit. European families discussed sensitive information in front of native servants whose intelligence they underestimated while their language skills they overestimated, creating intelligence opportunities that traditional military planning could utilize. Traditional concepts of warfare that emphasized patient observation and careful planning had been enhanced through European military education that provided systematic approaches to reconnaissance, target selection, and operational timing. Traditional patience combined with European tactical knowledge created operational capabilities that conventional colonial security planning had not anticipated. The weapon caches that André had established throughout their operational area utilized traditional concealment techniques enhanced with European understanding of ammunition storage, weapon maintenance, and logistical planning. Traditional knowledge of forest geography combined with European military logistics created supply systems that could support extended operations beyond colonial oversight. European hunting equipment that had been acquired from Thomas Beaumont's expedition provided firepower that traditional weapons could not match, while traditional knowledge of ammunition conservation and weapon maintenance ensured sustainable use of limited resources. European technological advantages could be turned against European targets through careful resource management and tactical discipline. Traditional concepts of territorial control that had governed inter-community conflicts could be adapted to establish operational areas where colonial security forces could not operate effectively. European administrators who had never studied traditional military geography remained vulnerable to traditional territorial strategies that controlled access to resources while denying them to enemies. Communication systems that had been developed for coordinating traditional hunting expeditions could be adapted for military operations that required precise timing and coordinated movement across extended areas. Traditional signaling methods that utilized natural acoustics and environmental markers provided secure communication that European technical surveillance could not intercept or decode. Traditional medicine that had been enhanced through access to European pharmaceutical supplies provided treatment capabilities for operational injuries while offering offensive capabilities through knowledge of poisons and toxic preparations that European medical training had inadvertently revealed. European pharmacology could be combined with traditional toxicology to create chemical warfare capabilities. The transportation networks that connected scattered settlements through traditional paths unknown to European cartographers provided movement capabilities that could support extended operations while avoiding colonial checkpoints and surveillance systems. Traditional geographic knowledge combined with European understanding of logistics created mobility advantages that conventional security forces could not match. European administrative procedures that Celeste had learned through domestic service and mission education provided intelligence about colonial decision-making processes, communication patterns, and operational planning that traditional military planning could exploit through advanced knowledge of European responses to resistance activities. European bureaucratic predictability created tactical advantages for opponents who understood administrative procedures. Traditional concepts of leadership that emphasized distributed authority and autonomous decision-making could be adapted to create operational structures that remained functional even when communication between units was impossible. European military hierarchies that depended on centralized command created vulnerabilities that traditional organizational methods could exploit through flexible response to changing tactical situations. The ritual preparation that preceded each operation included traditional ceremonies that ensured spiritual protection while maintaining psychological readiness for violence that colonial society condemned but that traditional spiritual obligations required. European moral frameworks could not address spiritual requirements that traditional society recognized as essential for maintaining cosmic balance. Traditional concepts of seasonal timing that had governed hunting expeditions and military campaigns could be applied to operational planning that utilized weather patterns, agricultural cycles, and traditional ceremonial schedules to maximize tactical advantages while minimizing risk of detection by colonial security forces unfamiliar with traditional timing considerations. European technical knowledge that André and Pierre had acquired through forced labor and military service could be combined with traditional craftsmanship to create modified equipment that served traditional purposes while utilizing European materials and manufacturing techniques. Traditional innovation could adapt European technology for purposes its designers had never contemplated. The psychological warfare techniques that had emerged from their campaign utilized traditional concepts of spiritual terror combined with European understanding of information dissemination to create fear that extended far beyond their immediate operational area. Traditional psychological warfare enhanced with European communication knowledge could multiply the tactical impact of limited operations. Part 10 Network Development and Ritualization. The acrid smoke of burning incense mixed with the copper scent of fresh blood as traditional drums echoed across the forest clearing where displaced families had gathered for ceremonies that colonial authorities would never understand. The rhythmic beating carried messages through the tropical night that connected scattered communities through communication networks that predated European arrival by centuries, now adapted for purposes that traditional society had never contemplated. Papa Joseph stood before the assembled families with authority that 73 years of life had earned through survival of slave raids, colonial conquest, and administrative oppression that had tested traditional leadership beyond its designed limits. His scarred hands held traditional symbols of judicial authority while his weathered voice carried pronouncements that would transform individual resistance into community obligation. The scarification ceremony that had begun with the Kabongo family's spiritual preparation had expanded to include 17 other families whose experiences with colonial brutality had prepared them for transformation beyond legal boundaries. Traditional initiation practices that had once marked passage into adult responsibilities now prepared community members for activities that traditional society had reserved for extreme circumstances involving existential threats to community survival. Traditional concepts of collective responsibility that had governed inter-community relationships required shared participation in activities that would restore moral balance disrupted by systematic oppression that legal systems refused to address. Colonial exploitation that had exceeded traditional limits for legitimate authority required community responses that individual families could not provide independently through isolated resistance efforts. The ritual consumption that had begun with individual acts of revenge had evolved into ceremonial practices that incorporated traditional concepts of spiritual communion with community obligations to honor ancestors through actions that demonstrated continued commitment to values that colonization had attempted to destroy. Shared meals that included flesh from colonial victims created bonds that transcended individual family loyalties. Sacred geography that had been established around the abandoned copal works now extended throughout the forest region through traditional practices that marked territorial boundaries and spiritual obligations. Trees carved with traditional symbols indicated areas under community protection while marking trails that connected ceremonial sites where spiritual preparation for resistance activities could occur without colonial interference. Traditional concepts of seasonal ceremony that had regulated community spiritual life could be adapted to coordinate resistance activities according to timing that maximized tactical advantages while maintaining spiritual obligations to ancestors who required regular acknowledgement through appropriate rituals. Colonial calendar systems that ignored traditional ceremonial requirements created opportunities for synchronized operations. Economic relationships that had developed between resistance communities and traditional settlements provided supply networks that could support extended operations while maintaining security through traditional practices that protected community members from colonial retaliation. Traditional trade relationships adapted for military purposes created logistical capabilities that European security forces could not detect or disrupt. Intelligence networks that connected forest communities with settlements near colonial installations provided information about European activities, security measures, and operational planning that resistance communities could utilize for tactical advantage. Traditional communication systems enhanced with European linguistic knowledge created intelligence capabilities that conventional security planning had not anticipated. Spiritual obligations that required community members to protect traditional values through active resistance to systems that threatened cultural survival created moral frameworks that justified activities colonial law condemned but that traditional justice recognized as necessary for community preservation. Traditional spiritual authority provided moral authorization that European legal systems could not override through administrative procedures. Traditional concepts of military leadership that emphasize collective decision-making and distributed authority could be adapted to coordinate resistance activities across multiple communities while maintaining operational security through traditional practices that protected leadership from identification by colonial authorities. Traditional organizational methods provided security advantages that European intelligence techniques could not penetrate. Medical knowledge that combined traditional healing practices with pharmaceutical supplies acquired from colonial victims provided treatment capabilities for operational injuries while offering offensive capabilities through enhanced understanding of toxic preparations and chemical warfare. Traditional medicine enhanced with European pharmacology created therapeutic and tactical advantages. Traditional concepts of territorial defense that had governed responses to external threats required community members to participate in activities that would eliminate threats to traditional territories and cultural practices. Colonial occupation that threatened complete cultural destruction qualified as existential threat that traditional military obligations required community members to address through appropriate methods. Weapon manufacturing that combined traditional craftsmanship with European materials and techniques created armaments that served traditional military purposes while utilizing modern technologies that enhanced effectiveness beyond traditional capabilities. Traditional innovation adapted European technology for purposes that colonial security planning had not considered possible for native communities. Training programs that combined traditional military education with European tactical knowledge provided preparation for resistance activities that exceeded traditional warfare capabilities while maintaining spiritual and cultural foundations that connected military activities to traditional values and community obligations. Traditional military culture enhanced with European techniques created operational capabilities that conventional security forces could not anticipate. Communication security that utilized traditional languages and cultural references provided operational security for resistance planning while maintaining connections to traditional practices that reinforce community identity and spiritual obligations. Traditional linguistic knowledge created security advantages that European intelligence services could not overcome through conventional surveillance techniques. Resource acquisition that combined traditional hunting and gathering knowledge with systematic appropriation of European equipment and supplies provided logistical support for extended operations while maintaining traditional practices that connected material activities to spiritual obligations and community welfare. Traditional resource management adapted for military purposes created sustainable operational capabilities. Traditional concepts of justice that required community participation in activities that restored moral balance disrupted by systematic oppression created collective obligations that transcended individual family interests while maintaining traditional values that colonial systems had attempted to destroy through administrative procedures and legal frameworks that ignored traditional authority and spiritual requirements. Part 11 Peak Operation and Symbolic Victory. The cathedral bells of Saint-Pierre rang across the Sankuru Valley at midnight on Christmas Eve as Mathieu Kabongo stood in the shadows beneath the main house of the Beaumont Estate, his weathered hands gripping traditional weapons enhanced with European steel that would transform Christian celebration into Old Testament judgment. The sacred music that called faithful Christians to celebrate divine birth would accompany human death that restored spiritual balance through methods that European theology condemned but that traditional justice demanded. Traditional surveillance that had monitored the estate for 6 weeks had revealed patterns of European domestic life that made Christmas Eve the optimal moment for operations that would demonstrate the complete reversal of colonial power relationships. European religious observance that emphasized peace and forgiveness had created security vulnerabilities that traditional military planning could exploit through coordinated attacks that European defensive preparations had never anticipated. Charles Beaumont had spent Christmas Eve hosting dinner parties that displayed colonial wealth extracted from native labor while European guests celebrated religious traditions that preached love while practicing systematic hatred toward the communities whose exploitation financed their luxurious festivities. Traditional concepts of justice that required proportional response to systematic injury demanded that Christmas morning would provide education about consequences of treating human beings as renewable resources. Celeste had positioned herself near the main house kitchen where her domestic service experience provided access to European family routines while her traditional stealth training enabled movement through colonial security that relied on technological rather than human surveillance. European confidence in mechanical systems created vulnerabilities that traditional infiltration techniques could exploit through understanding of human behavior patterns. André and Pierre had established positions that controlled access routes between the main house and colonial security installations while providing fields of fire that European military training had taught them to utilize for maximum tactical advantage. Traditional knowledge of terrain features combined with European understanding of ballistics created defensive positions that conventional assault techniques could not overcome through standard tactical approaches. Marie had assumed her role as domestic servant attending European Christmas celebrations while carrying concealed weapons that traditional craftsmanship had designed for close quarters combat in situations where European firearms would prove ineffective. Traditional assassin techniques enhanced with European anatomical knowledge created killing capabilities that colonial security planning had never considered possible for native domestic workers. Traditional timing that coordinated operations according to spiritual requirements and tactical advantages indicated that Christmas morning would provide optimal conditions for operations that combined maximum symbolic impact with practical advantages created by European religious observance that reduced security alertness while concentrating targets in predictable locations during extended periods of celebration. European domestic routines that had been observed through traditional surveillance techniques revealed security patterns that made coordinated assault possible through simultaneous attacks on multiple targets who would be unable to coordinate defensive responses due to traditional communication disruption and systematic elimination of leadership personnel who might organize effective resistance to organized attack. Traditional concepts of spiritual warfare that governed conflicts between religious systems required that operations against Christian targets include appropriate ceremonial elements that honored traditional spiritual obligations while demonstrating contempt for European religious practices that justified systematic oppression through theological frameworks that violated basic principles of divine justice and human dignity. Sacred preparation that had included traditional purification rituals and ancestral consultation provided spiritual authorization for activities that would violate European moral frameworks while maintaining traditional spiritual protection that was necessary for warriors who engaged in legitimate combat against enemies who had committed systematic crimes against traditional communities and spiritual obligations. The infiltration that began at midnight utilized traditional stealth techniques enhanced with European understanding of colonial security systems and domestic architecture that enabled access to defended positions through routes that European defensive planning had not considered because colonial military education emphasized conventional assault tactics rather than traditional infiltration methods. European Christmas celebrations that emphasized family gatherings and religious observance created tactical opportunities for simultaneous attacks on multiple targets who would be concentrated in predictable locations during extended periods when normal security procedures were relaxed due to holiday festivities that European traditions required regardless of security considerations or operational risks. Traditional concepts of collective justice that required community participation in activities that would restore moral balance could be implemented through coordinated operations that involved multiple families and simultaneous attacks that demonstrated community commitment to resistance while preventing European authorities from focusing retaliation on individual families who might be eliminated through conventional colonial punishment procedures. Weapon deployment that utilized traditional close-quarters combat techniques enhanced with European understanding of anatomy and tactical movement created killing capabilities that could eliminate multiple targets rapidly while maintaining operational security through traditional methods that prevented identification of attackers who could withdraw through escape routes that European pursuit efforts could not follow effectively. Traditional ceremonies that accompanied legitimate warfare required appropriate spiritual preparation and ritual observance that honored ancestors while requesting divine assistance for activities that served traditional values and community obligations rather than individual interests or criminal purposes that would violate spiritual requirements and traditional concepts of legitimate military action. European domestic architecture that had been designed to demonstrate colonial superiority through visual impact rather than defensive capability created vulnerabilities that traditional assault techniques could exploit through understanding of structural weak points and access routes that European architects had not considered because colonial construction emphasized appearance rather than security consideration. Charles Beaumont discovered the reality of reversed power relationships when traditional justice entered his dining room at exactly 3:27 a.m. on Christmas morning, transforming European celebration into educational demonstration about consequences of systematic oppression that colonial legal systems had refused to address through conventional administrative procedures that ignored native humanity while demanding native submission. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.